Welcome to the Save What You Love podcast. I'm still your host, Mark Titus. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, I get to sit down with Dr. Aaron Adams. He is the Director of Science and Conservation at the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust in South Florida. He's also Senior Scientist of the Harbor Branch at the Oceanographic Institute at Florida Atlantic University. And to start out, Aaron received a bachelor's degree from St. Mary's College in Maryland, a master's degree from the College of William and Mary, and a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and also holds a Coast Guard captain's license. Go Aaron. He has lived, worked, and fished on both coasts of the U.S. and in the Caribbean, where he's been conducting fish research for more than 25 years. His pursuit of effective fish and habitat conservation is rooted in his years growing up near Chesapeake Bay, where he witnessed the decline of the bay's habitats and fisheries. Dr. Adams has been an author or co-author of more than 70 peer-reviewed scientific publications, has authored 3 books, and contributed chapters to 4 books. In addition to his scientific focus, he spends considerable effort translating fish science into anglers' terms. Thank God for that. Today we speak about the incredibly cool nature of bonefish and tarpon, both as species and game fish, the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust's mission, the important nature of connection with guides on the ground to doing the work, both as a scientist and as a storyteller. Habitat devastation, but the light at the end of the tunnel. Young people getting engaged, so important. And the vital importance of connection. What a great conversation. Gonna warn you ahead of time, this is heavy on fly fishing nerddom. If you're into that sort of thing, you're going to go bananas for this episode. If you're not quite there yet, maybe you'll get into it later. But it's a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Hope you enjoy it. You're in for a gem. Onward.
How do you say what you love when the world is burning down? How do you say what you love when pushes come to shove? How do you say what you love when things are upside down? How do you say what you love when times are getting tough?
Dr. Aaron Adams, welcome. Where are you today?
Thanks for having me on the podcast. I am in my home office in East Central Florida, where it's been raining a lot the past few days.
Really? Is that different for this time of year? Or do you guys get that all in the afternoon like I remember in the South?
No, we should be in our rainy season, but it's been dry. Now we've got a tropical disturbance, not a hurricane or anything, but just tropical weather. So it's been raining most of the time now for the past few days.
Is that a welcome thing?
Very welcome, because we were in a drought situation, so we'll take it.
Excellent. Yeah, you know what? Anytime it's the same up here. I mean, we get some grousing about, it's raining. And I'm like, man, bring it. I'll take this any day over. We are living in wildfire time now. It's every summer. I grew up here and it wasn't like that before, but it is now. It's like every summer, here it comes. So yeah, I'll take the rain. Well, I am so excited to have you on this show for a variety of reasons. I love your backstory and how you got into the work you do, but it's not about me. I'd love for you to share that with our listeners. Tell us your story. How did you get into this beautiful work that you do that I think is a perfect expression of saving the things we love?
It all goes back to my parents, I think. I started fishing. I was probably 4 years old. There's pictures of me with a fishing rod and 4 years old and walking down a path to the water. So yeah, that passion started really early. My dad and my uncle were pretty good mentors in that sense. Something I think is kind of lacking for a lot of today's young anglers is that mentorship of the older generations. And so that was very impactful. And then I pretty quickly gravitated towards the science end of things. I remember fishing in a tidal creek on the western shoreline of Chesapeake Bay, a place that my family used to go camping a lot. And I'd go and first few times, and this little kind of side channel, and I was catching all kinds of sunfish, and then one time I went back and it was dry. There was no water, and I was astounded. And of course, the tide was out. And so I asked a lot of questions and just started trying to kind of figure out a lot of the whys. So pretty early on, the mix of fishing and science kind of started to ping off each other. So yeah, that started a lot with freshwater fishing, but then growing up in and then near Baltimore, near Chesapeake Bay, spent a lot of time on the bay, was really influential too. I mean, just experiencing the mix of the salt and freshwater worlds in an estuary the size of Chesapeake Bay is kind of hard to describe unless you experience it. I mean, in a day, you could go from catching largemouth bass and sunfish or bluegill to striped bass, to bluefish, and even to things like cobia. All easily, all in a day, depending on where you are. And then, geez, grew up eating blue crabs, steamed blue crabs, oysters, all those types of things that were just kind of taken for granted because they were so super abundant. But then as I grew up, the Chesapeake Bay started to collapse ecologically. The oyster fishery collapsed in part because of overharvest, in part because of disease. The seagrasses started to disappear. The striped bass fishery, what we call the Maryland rockfish, that plummeted, bottomed out, so much so that they shut down the fishery entirely for at least 5 years, in some cases longer, and then had some super great luck at the same time that closure happened, and the striped bass fishery came back pretty well over time. It took some time. And so that was pretty formative for me as well, because I'd gotten to understand, of course, the passion for fishing, but then I got to understand a lot of the ecology of the fish and their habitats, and then seeing the bay collapse kind of drove me toward doing science to apply to management conservation. So not just satisfying the scientific curiosity, which has value in its own right, but making sure that that scientific curiosity actually fed into the incredibly large list of needs from habitat management, conservation, all that types of things. I mean, in many ways, it's really no different than the tragedy of the salmon.
Right.
The conversation could pretty quickly go down a deep and dark hole. But I'm an optimist. I mean, I fly fish, so I have to be an optimist. And then I would guess the later in career, in addition to good mentors, what kind of sealed things for me is when I was in graduate school at University of Massachusetts in Boston, I was tasked with putting together a seminar series one semester on marine conservation. And so I invited a number of amazing conservation scientists, all of whom were older than myself, the baby boom generation. And despite as impactful as they were at the time, every single one of them said that they regretted not taking action earlier, thinking that, oh, we'll understand these things and it'll be okay. And then as they work through their careers, seeing things not be okay. And so that kind of took me up to the next level of making sure that the work that I did applied to not letting things get so bad like that, and to actually improving them where they can.
So I'm hearing there was a lot of personal observation and then personal feeling in this. And of course, as a scientist, you need to be objective and to gather data, and it's not necessarily the portal for emotional response. But it sounds to me like it did come, at least the impetus to go down this trail came from an emotional response. Is that accurate?
For sure. The passion that comes from the fishing, but the science is what drives me in, my career choice. And I think the science can be done and is done by myself and others with that objectivity. But that doesn't mean that it has to be divorced from the passion needed to get that objective science applied to conservation.
Right.
I mean, you know very well, the process of conservation and policy is ugly. It's not direct. It's not clean. There's a lot of people treating others badly. And so you have to have that passion to work through all of that muckiness after the science has been done. So yeah, it's I don't see it as a conflict at all to be able to be objective as a scientist, but also willing to put on a different hat, and have the passion of being part of the system to make sure that it's applied and understood.
That's great.
I mean, I think a great thing that you do is you take a lot of that science or talk to scientists, and get their input, and then you apply the passion, which is fantastic, for that to happen. But I think it, go ahead.
No, please finish your thought.
But yeah, but I think that more and more scientists are moving away from the standard academic position of being one step removed from in that kind of involvement, and seeing the value in having those two different hats.
I love spending time with scientists like you, and to have dear friends who are scientists, and I love sense of humor, and the just the raw dedication to me is something that just blows my mind all the time. Like, I think I'm not officially diagnosed, but I think I am ADHD, and I think I'm way too just all over the map to have that discipline. But what we talk about a lot is that very thing of like translating these sets of data into meaningful storytelling. And I think it's a fit and a partnership that I absolutely love. So thanks for saying that. That's awesome. That means a lot. We're going to dive into more about policy and about your work here, but to set the table for our listeners, most of us listening are West Coasters, which is why it was so exciting to me to get the opportunity to talk to you. And we're into salmon and trout and such. And paint us a landscape. Why tarpon? Why bonefish? I fished for bonefish when I went to Maui last with my wife, and I went out with a guide, and I actually got a shot at a bonefish. The guide was gasping because he said could have been a record, and of course that bonefish came up and took one look at my offering, and then headed for Japan. That was it. That was my one shot. So, but like the whole picture, let's geek out. What is their ecosystem like? What are they like as a species? And what are they like as a game fish? Permission to dork out obnoxiously as a fly fisherman granted.
Okay, God, where do we start?
Yeah, I know.
That's like talking about the origins of life itself.
That's right.
Well, I mean, I can start with tarpon,
Okay.
because I'm gearing up to go tarpon fishing this weekend. It's some old haunts. They've been around for 100 million years in the form that they're in now. And they're still doing the same thing that they were doing back then, and doing it really well.
Wow.
So you're basically fishing for dinosaurs, which just is kind of, from many different perspectives, is kind of mind-blowing. A lot of the fish we have nowadays are much more recently evolved. But tarpon have been doing it this way for, over 100 million years. The sight fishing aspect is hard to describe until you experience it. So say you're fishing for trout, and you're a dry fly enthusiast. It's very similar to that in many respects. You have to see the trout. Depending on the water, you might be able to walk along a stream, spring-fed stream, very clear, and actually see the trout, and then back off and cast, etc. So it's got those kinds of aspects. The casting accuracy is important, right? You have to see the fish. Once you see the fish, you have to make the cast. And as you saw with the bonefish, even if you make the cast, they could, flip you off anyway.
Exactly.
Especially older fish that have seen it all before.
Yeah.
So that to me, it's the visual nature of flats fishing is probably the top draw. When I have gone trout fishing or salmon fishing, the big draw for me is the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So floating a river, say in Montana or Wyoming or whatnot, I spend as much time looking around at the canyons and everything else as I do the fishing. It's that landscape. When you're in the tropics and you're fishing for bonefish, tarpon, permit, snook, you name it, there's a visual aspect, which I described, not especially eloquently, but there's all the different visual and inputs. So you have to process so much. If you're waiting or you're on the bow of a skiff, it doesn't really matter. The water's always moving. The fish are always moving. As you move, the bottom's always changing from sand to seagrass to maybe algae to rocky. You could be fishing along a mangrove shoreline. That provides a different aspect. You could be fishing along a sand ridge or a drop-off. There's just kind of an overwhelming amount of visual stimulation that you have to process. And you have to process that in a way that allows you to focus on, number one, seeing the fish. And that sounds easy, but God, it's not.
No, it's not. I
People
definitely agree.
When people first go bone fishing, for example,
Oh my
and I'll
God.
call bonefish the gateway drug.
Okay, right on.
Because of the three, they're the easiest.
Oh God.
And that's all
Oh, man.
relative.
Yeah. Woo.
That's all relative.
Got a lot of steep learning curve.
Yeah. Bonefish with their silvery reflective scales, ability to change color somewhat, they can be pretty much invisible. And so your brain has to develop an image recognition. So I'll never forget the first bonefish that my brain caught by that image recognition. It was a white sand flat. It was in the British Virgin Islands on the island of Anegada. The whole south side is just one big sand flat. And in hindsight, I know what happened, but my brain saw the fish. I automatically started to cast. I cast at the fish and I caught it.
Oh, wow.
And in hindsight, what my brain had seen, had processed, was the eye of the fish.
Huh.
Right? Because that was different. It stood out as a different structure than the sand flat and the algae and all the other things that the body was reflecting.
Wow.
And so there's a big learning curve of being on the water enough to see those things that are different. You don't always see the fish. You might see a shadow. You might see, like for permit, they have like a black edge on their dorsal fin or their tail. For tarpon, sometimes you see it's almost like you're watching the Matrix movie. There's a seagrass bed or there's a bottom, but there's a piece of that bottom that looks like it's been digitally changed.
Huh. That's
And
so cool.
Yeah, those are the things that you're looking for. So, and you're looking for those, as I said, in a mix of overwhelming visual stimuli. of all the things. And then, of course, it gets windy. It's always windy.
Jeez.
It's sunny, or it might have clouds coming across. All of a sudden, there's shade.
Right.
There might be tide. There might be wind, waves. Yeah, so it's you almost have to be in a somewhat of a Zen type of state to be able to have that focus. And you can't maintain that all day. You just can't. And so if you're fishing with somebody, say on a flat skiff and it's kind of slow, and you start to chat, that's when you miss the fish. Fish will come by and you miss them because you've kind of lost that focus, that concentration. So yeah, it's a very, I mean, you have to have that drive to kind of go through and pursue all that.
It's from the little I've done. I see everything you're saying, and Hawaii's a little different. In Maui, it's not sand flats. It's
Right.
kind of rocky structure. So
Right, old reef.
yeah, exactly, old reef. So it's flat, but you've got a little bit even more kind of camouflage to deal with. And the guide I was with is like, look for the green Sprite bottle. The hovering green Sprite bottle. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And and I remember, same as you, you keyed in on the eye, but I remember like this sort of luminescent just greenness that just appeared. And I was like, oh my God, after 3 hours of searching, intently focusing, there it is. It just appeared. And it was kind of like you say, a Zen sort of letting go more than it was. My eye keenly spotted that, it was a letting go, and there it appeared. And I love it. If I was near that structure, I would be fishing every moment I could.
And Hawaii bonefish have a different appearance than the Caribbean bonefish. They tend to have that greener hue to them, that brighter greener hue than Caribbean bonefish. And they tend to be a bit longer, kind of elongated. So in the Caribbean, what they often most look like is a barracuda.
Okay.
So when I fished in Hawaii, I kind of forced my mind to think about looking for a barracuda because it's a more similar shape and image type of recognition type of thing.
Wow.
And that's one of the beauty of being with a guide is they know all those local nuances.
That's right.
Right. So if you fish in a stream in Montana versus one in Wyoming versus one in Northern California, et cetera, there's going to be different nuances.
Of course.
And a good angler will be able to cut through a lot of that learning curve, but that final piece, right, the final 10 feet, is that local knowledge for sure.
Oh, for sure. What about tarpon? Like, walk me through a little of that experience. That is when I don't have my dad. My dad passed in the autumn of last year, but before he did, he gave me all of his tarpon flies. He had been on a sailboat in Belize, and of all the guys on the boat, he was obsessed, and he caught a tarpon on a fly off the sailboat, and he said it was one of the great experiences of his entire life. Tell me. If we're starting with the gateway drug with bonefish, give me a little escalation here with tarpon.
Okay, so tarpon, there's different ways to fish for them. Mm-hmm. You can go out at the crack ass of dawn when it tends to be calm. The sun's not even up yet. I don't mean launching at dawn and you see the sun up. You're already out there. It's hard to see, kind of still dark. And a lot of times tarpon, they'll kind of lay up or hang out overnight. And then they'll start to come to the surface and gulp air. So tarpon are different than most other fish in that their air bladder is modified so that it's similar to a lung. So they can actually gulp air at the surface and process that oxygen the same way that we would through our lungs. So it kind of helps them augment the oxygen to get through their gills like other fish. They don't have to do that to get enough oxygen, but it augments for sure. And I think it's also some kind of a behavioral communication type of thing. So if you go out for the dawn patrol, you're looking for those rollers, and you see a roller come up. It's more like similar to porpoising. You might see a porpoise do. their mouth comes up first. If you're close enough, you can actually hear them expel and then take in some air. And then the rest of their body kind of rolls through that. You see that, and you cast a few feet ahead of that roll and try and intercept them. And that's fun because it's sight fishing. Everything's so calm on the best mornings. It's yeah, that time of day for me is when that first glow of dawn is just coming, and it's slick calm, and there's tarpon rolling. I mean, I get chills just talking about it.
You've painted a beautiful picture. I am right there with you, and I want to go out fishing right now. God, that's awesome.
Then later in the day, once the sun comes up, say 9 o'clock or so, then you can start sight fishing for the fish swimming in the water. There's a few ways to do that. The most common are to be on it's called the ocean side versus the bay side of where you might be, and finding a lane where the tarpon are swimming. And they might be in singles or pairs or long, what we call strings. A school of maybe 30 or so would be strung out, nose to tail. Kind of like you might see elephants sometimes traveling. So you can set yourself up, and this comes with local knowledge of some of those movement pathways, a ridge or sandbank or something like that, and fish for them that way. So that's sight fishing. They'll roll when they're doing that, but mostly you're looking for those fish that are swimming. And they'll be anywhere from a bright silver to kind of an aqua green to almost like a brown on top. And so learning those different patterns. For that, you see the fish coming, it's making the cast to get it in front of the fish without spooking them. And then, just kind of manipulating the fly in a way that gets them to bite. And that takes a lot of, sometimes luck is important too, but yeah, it takes a lot of skill. And the better anglers are really good at knowing what it takes to feed those fish. Yeah.
In my case, plenty of luck would be necessary. And what type of flies are you using for these guys?
It all depends on the situation. In places where tarpon haven't been heavily pressured, I'll use flies that are pretty big, something like that. That was at about 5 inches. In places where tarpon have been pretty pressured, it'll be flies that are much smaller, just maybe 3 inches long, sometimes even smaller. Which you see that in trout fishing as well, right? The more pressured they are, the more picky they get, and the smaller the flies. And then trying to figure out what the prey they're going to be most interested in where they are, how they're behaving, what the conditions have been. Yeah, and that's kind of where for me, a lot of the science comes back in, is trying to access all that type of information. If you get into the zen of it, it's like learning to think like a fish.
That's right.
Right? They don't think; they're just there. That's what they are. That's what they do. But being able to try and figure that out is a huge part of the game for sure.
Well, that's a wonderful segue. Let's dive right into it. Bonefish and Tarpon Trust was formed in 1998. Why?
A bunch of anglers and fishing guides in the Florida Keys saw a decline in bonefish and tarpon numbers during that time, and were concerned about it. They pretty quickly learned. They started as Bonefish Tarpon Unlimited. Basically, their founding members threw money in a hat and tried to start funding some stuff. They pretty quickly learned that there was very little known scientifically about bonefish or tarpon. And a few years later, added permit, and even less known about them. And so they started out as Bonefish Tarpon Unlimited, thinking along the lines of Trout Unlimited, advocating for conservation. But without any science, what do you advocate for? So pretty quickly evolved to become Bonefish Tarpon Trust officially by 2009. But well prior to that, a science-based conservation organization. So for me as a conservation-focused scientist, BTT is pretty unique because, for a number of reasons. One, but it's science-based conservation. Some other groups, and there's needs for all different kinds of groups, have advocacy positions and they might need science to support those, and so they'll fund science or work with others who might do the science. What we do is we work with resource management agencies. We work with anglers, guides and anglers, and then our own scientists to assess the status of knowledge, the knowledge gaps, and management needs and threats, of course, conservation threats. And we use that to prioritize the type of information that is most needed in order to inform management. And that's the type of research that we conduct or fund others to conduct. And so it's a very integrated process with the fishing community. Countless hours on the water, they know a lot.
Right.
And so that's just absolutely essential. Working closely with the resource management agencies is important, because what we don't want to do is what's called hopeful science, where a scientist applies for a grant to do some cool research, does the research, and then kind of hopes the results will apply to management. And I used to be guilty of this many years ago. A lot of what scientists do is they do the research, and then a big way that we're evaluated at academic institutions is we have to publish that research in scientific journals. And so as part of those research articles, we'll summarize the research and why it was done and the results. And then at the end, we might do a little bit of hand waving, saying, oh, and this can apply to management because. That's hopeful science.
Got it.
That's different than doing directed science that is aimed to address a specific question with a known management application. You still don't know the answer, or you wouldn't do the research, but it's kind of a little bit of a different approach, and so that's super rewarding as well.
Well, let's dive into that a moment. What that direct approach? What are we talking about? And I know this is voluminous, but to really kind of get a high level look at this for our listeners, what are the attributes that you're looking at that are under threat and that you're addressing with your direct science?
Yeah, it's kind of how much time do you have?
I know it's huge.
So I'll pick one, since we're talking about bonefish.
Yep.
In the Bahamas, bonefish are catch and release only, except for Bahamians are allowed to keep bonefish they catch with hook and line, for consumption, individual personal consumption. So there's no commercial fishery, there's no netting, any of that stuff that would lead to overfishing. So the biggest concern there is habitat loss. And so we worked with fishing guides to identify the movement patterns and habitat use for bonefish. That included figuring out where bonefish spawn. So we know from doing a lot of tagging of fish and recaptures and tracking that adult bonefish have a pretty small home range. But then they'll migrate 70, 80 or more miles to get to what we call pre-spawning aggregation location, which is typically a bay, deepish bay, protected from seasonal winds. They spawn during the winter, but near a deep water drop-off, because they go offshore and go down to about 400 or so feet in order to spawn.
Wow.
Right, and then they come back up and they go home. Most of us will come out of a shopping center and can't find where we parked the car. These fish can do all that.
I love that.
Right, so we were addressing the need for habitat conservation. Worked with Bahamas National Trust, which is kind of their version of the National Park Service, to put those locations that we'd identified as home ranges and also spawning locations, and trying to get those in national parks or other types of protected areas.
Amazing.
So we knew the need for habitat information, and then work from there.
So you're dealing with many agencies and governments in across the spectrum here.
Yeah. Where do we work? Bahamas, Cuba, Belize, Mexico, Florida, of course. All the states, say, from tarpon migrate regularly as far as Chesapeake Bay on the East Coast and around the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico, yeah, a lot of different places. We're doing a lot of work now in Belize to try and focus on habitat, for example. And all those require interactions with the fishing community, as well as the various resource management agencies and governments and policy and all that kind of stuff.
I might guess that dealing with the fishing community is a little bit easier and a little bit more fun than dealing with red tape with bureaucracy. Halftime. Did you know you could have the world's finest wild salmon shipped directly to your door? It's true. Our Ava's Wild Bristol Bay sockeye salmon is the lowest carbon footprint center plate protein on the planet, and it's packed with heart-healthy omega-3 fatty acids. Don't take our word for it. Ask chefs like Seattle's Tom Douglas and Taichi Kitamura, who are serving our sashimi-grade wild salmon in their award-winning restaurants. You can have the exact same fillets we deliver to them shipped flash frozen to your door. What's more, Ava's Wild donates 10% of our profits to indigenous-led efforts to protect Bristol Bay in perpetuity. That's the place we source the salmon from. Right now, that looks like supporting the Bristol Bay Foundation, granting Bristol Bay's indigenous young people scholarships to four-year colleges, universities, and trade schools. Visit avaswild.com to join our growing community doing good by eating right. That's save, spelled backwards, wild.com. And eat wild to save wild. Now, back to the show. I want to dial in on that, though. I was a guide for over a decade in Alaska, and I love that life. It's a huge part of what you do. And how important is that interaction with sport fishing guides? And where did you personally learn that art of interacting with guides and captains to help in the work that you're doing as a scientist?
Well, I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, but I'm still learning. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're not learning something every day, then you should probably be doing something else. But yeah, it's essential. I mean, it's a requirement. It's essential. What other words? Because they're the ones who are on the water every day. They see everything. And so they're seeing the threats, seeing changes in the fishery, all those different aspects from on the water, but also it's a back and forth, helping to work with them to develop a longer term vision of not just next year, next week, or 5 years from now, but 10 years from now. What do you want this to look like? What are the threats that might be coming? Is there going to be more boat traffic? Are we going to be overrun by jet skis? Those types of things. But also using, if you take a purely science perspective, the information that a lot of guides have is fantastic for setting up the framework or design of some research to test predictions and make hypotheses. Or you might have scientific hypotheses that you work with the guides to refine or to test. So there has to be a lot of that back and forth. Where did I first learn that? When I was young, my dad was doing a lot of sociological research. He still helped in the infancy of, for example, setting up some drug rehab clinics and doing a lot of the street research work in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And so pretty early on, the importance of that type of communication to me I could see that as important. And my mom was a kindergarten teacher, so that was kind of ingrained in me a long time ago. And then just as I came through the world of becoming a marine biologist, seeing the difference in results of colleagues or mentors who developed relationships with fishing communities versus those who kind of stayed away and might show up for occasional meeting but didn't have those relationships. So it should become, after a while, it kind of comes ingrained, right? Is that type of communication back and forth, but it's essential. The other thing too is you can't introduce yourself a second time. So you have to have your act together before you go in and want to work with, whether it's anglers or scientists or anybody else. Um, and so it's important to do your background research and kind of figure some things out so at least you can um, have a good conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would imagine hearing you talk about this that the work output with folks that do have those relationships like you were describing versus folks that just kind of show up once in a while to the required meetings, I bet it's a stark contrast.
Yeah, it is. There's a term, some guys from Puerto Rico, a fishing community at a conference I went to last year. The term they used was helicopter science. Other people have said parachute science, where a scientist might come in, kind of introduce themselves to a community, have a project they want to do, develop some relationships for that. Project's over, they leave, and that's it. And that doesn't mean that good research isn't being done. It often or even usually is. It's that the relationship to the community that lives with or relies on those resources isn't complete. It's not continued. So the kind of stuff that we're talking about is based on long-term relationships. It's not just a one-off, right? Because you have to build the trust in the first place to be able to have the communications. But you also have to be able to have that information exchange and back and forth over the long term, because none of this is static. It's dynamic. It's always changing. So the scientific output can still be solid on either approach, but the applicability of that and the integration of that differs, dramatically for sure.
I have an example of that too in my life as a storyteller. It's the same paradigm of whether you just helicopter in, use that term, to a location you're going to film with different characters, different subjects of a documentary, versus spending time there, going to people's homes, having meals together. It's a completely different animal. I mean, it just is. You may get good footage, just sort of flying in and flying out, but there's an edge to it. There's maybe that's a softening. Actually, it's a softening of that edge. I think that is nuanced and subtle, but very, very real and perceptible on screen. And most importantly, I'm missing out if I'm just in and out. I'm taking that benefit of that gift of that human interaction, a new friendship and a new experience, and so that's really validating and a cool thing to hear about your work.
And you might also, you're not going to tell the same story. You're not going to have the depth. If you fly in, do the story, and leave, there's going to be things that you miss. You might be telling a completely different story. It's like, let's say you're working on a storyboard or you're working on a book.
Yes.
The first draft is never what ends up right on screen or in print. And oftentimes what actually ends up there is a completely different beast because of that depth. And so when it comes to doing work that affects people's livelihoods, that's even more responsibility.
Oh yeah.
And so it's kind of going back to your original questions about how I got into all this kind of life story, trying to describe to people, how this works, what this means, et cetera, is I used to talk about it being a lifestyle. The fishing, the research, the cultural interactions, the surfing, all that kind of stuff, all the water, right?
Yeah.
All the water-centric things. But it's not a lifestyle. It's a way of living. And that's a difference. A lifestyle is something that you do. A way of living is who and what you are.
Yeah.
And how you interact with other people. And when you can kind of transcend that from that superficial to the more ingrained level, then I think it's more fulfilling for me, of course, but also for the people that I and colleagues work with, because there's that common uh, intellectual and emotional connection. Yeah, so it's a way of living.
That's so great.
Different. Yeah.
It's so great. I love that. Um, and you have you've got some hours put in now over the years. Tell us about what you've observed in terms of habitat changing, climate change, and even habitat devastation, with, of course, the central lens of bonefish, tarpon, and permit, and other fish species.
Um, okay. It could get pretty dark.
That's okay. We
But
don't shy away from that on this show.
okay. I'm gonna start by saying it can get pretty dark, but I think there's also some light at the end of the tunnel.
Good.
Um,
I figured.
yeah, so and one more step back, Bonefish Tarpon Permit are the focus for Bonefish Tarpon Trust. From a conservation and science perspective, they give us a good testing ground for conceptual models for general conservation. And that's because there's no commercial fishery for those species. So we don't have all those politics that go with salmon or red snapper or whatever the case may be for species that are overfished, or there's allocation issues or whatever the case may be. And so we can use these species to kind of focus on the habitat-based approach to all of this, and the cultural-based approach.
Good point.
And then hopefully have some of that, and it is being applied by others in other fisheries. So kind of a proving ground. But as far as what I've seen, there's good and there's bad. There's a hell of a lot of bad.
Yeah.
Where I live now, near Melbourne, Florida, Indian River Lagoon on the east coast of Florida, it's an absolute mess. Pretty much all the seagrass is gone. I'd say 90%, because of water quality issues. I mean, I can pull my skiff a solid 8 miles from the closest inlet along these flats and not see a blade of seagrass.
Wow.
And it used to be solid seagrass. As I said, Chesapeake Bay growing up, that was pretty humbling. It's taken them 40 years or so, but they're getting some good results from a lot of concerted efforts. Belize is having a lot of major challenges with coastal development, some of it legal, some of it not. That can be challenging because, Belize needs jobs, but mass tourism doesn't bring good quality jobs. It doesn't bring cultural support. It brings typically cultural wastelands, because so there's a lot of push and pull, trying to, similar to what people have been trying to do with salmon, is thinking of long-term, consistent, sustainable use of the resource.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast to our current version of, a Western view of infinite growth.
Right.
And there's no such thing as infinite growth on a finite planet.
That's right.
So at some point we either learn to live sustainably or I mean, Yvon Chouinard's great at saying, if you don't get this understood quickly, you kiss humans goodbye. He says it more eloquently than I do. So yeah, I see a lot of habitat loss, a lot of habitat destruction. The biggest concern for me in a lot of places is water quality decline. Too many nutrients, pollutants going into the water, causing these massive plankton blooms that cause fish kills and kill seagrass. Loss of fisheries. I mean, Indian River Lagoon right now, the red drum fishery is closed. Even though it was already only recreational, not commercial, but it was totally closed to harvest now because population crashed due to habitat loss and water quality declines, not because of fishing pressure. That's pretty damn depressing, right? If you go into the tropics, the coral bleaching is absolutely overwhelming and indescribable. Any pictures, videos you see, you don't really understand. unless you've seen what live reefs look like, and then you go back to the same ones and you see what they look like now. It's yeah, I've had colleagues, break down um, by seeing that. So that's that's mostly climate change, but pollution as well. So yeah, it can get pretty damn depressing. One of the things that people don't understand is it's not just climate change. It's not just habitat loss. It's not just water quality. It's not just your dams breaking up river flows. It's the combination of all of those. They all interact with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had healthy habitats and clean water, systems are much more likely to be able to adapt to climate change, to limits, of course. But since there aren't that many places that have natural, healthy, functioning ecosystems, they're less capable of responding in a positive way to what's going on with climate change. That's pretty damn depressing. The light at the end of the tunnel is that we know what the problems are, right? It's not like we don't know the cause of all this stuff. We know every single cause. So I think of it for if I was say a cancer doctor, and I have a patient come in and they've got cancer, but we have no idea what type of cancer, how to treat it, right? That's horrific. But now the cancer research has come along so far, most cancers are at least identifiable, and more of them are treatable. So some cancers are, terminal, but the portion that are relative to say 30 years ago is drastically different. So if we were to think of ourselves as cancer doctors, we have all those tools, every single one of those tools. And the problem is that our policymakers aren't applying the tools. They're allowing the cancer to spread, even though we have the tools. But it's not just the policymakers, it's us. And so to me, the big light in the tunnel is I have people ask me all the time, well, what can I do?
Yeah, exactly.
And my response is look in the mirror, because you're the only one who can have the solution. We're in a democracy. If we start voting on these types of issues as being important, these issues will be fixed. If we start living our own lives in ways that reduce these types of impacts, that will help fix things. So yeah, there's a lot of self-reflection in all of that. And that's often not well received. But yeah, there's a lot of ways we can do it individually, but the scale that we're working on right now requires full government action to basically, but it's also a lifestyle change.
Absolutely.
Everything we do, it's a lifestyle change for sure.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that is going to be a central, if not the central theme in my upcoming third and final film in my salmon trilogy, The Turn, about that look in the mirror, that deep look in the mirror, because I don't believe systems change is possible without change from within, on the individual level first. So good on you. Another piece I found as a light on the horizon is the work you all are doing with young people. You have a program dedicated with young people. How important is that? And how does it make you feel seeing young people get involved in your work?
It's extremely important for many reasons. One of which, I was just having a conversation with a colleague the other day. When kids learn at school about all this stuff, oftentimes they'll go home and they might ask their parents, "Why are you spreading fertilizer on the lawn?" And then the question becomes, "Why do we even have a lawn?"
There you go.
So that's one kind of immediate, but learning young, kind of like I did, and others, that helps to create that way of living that is going to be required for, as you said, kind of a complete change in how we do things. So having that type of relationship with younger people is a big part of that. So like in the Bahamas, for example, we're doing a lot of mangrove restoration. because Hurricane Dorian destroyed just tens of square miles of mangroves. A large part of that is including school groups. And this is not at all just the Bahamas, it's common everywhere, but a lot of the kids didn't really have an understanding or relationship with the ocean, with the flats, with the mangroves. But incorporating them into all this and working with Bahamas National Trust to create a school curriculum that teachers could use in schools, that's making a big difference in a better general understanding of their relationship with the nature that's around them. We're doing the same thing in Belize with distributing training manuals to teachers and then materials to students around coastal Belize. We've created lesson plans that have been vetted for use in Florida schools. And all this, of course, is publicly available as much as we can get it out. You know, we have a conservation program where we have youth ambassadors that, just take it onto themselves to be good spokespeople for all this type of thing. And that's important, if not essential, to having that lifestyle change that we're going to really need to do, but also to do much more rapidly to make the changes or to stop the bad changes from happening. Yeah.
You mentioned something early on that really struck me about a dearth of mentorship. And I see that too. It's something that's really important to me, trying to carve time out. We're all busy. We're all working faster and faster. But I have 10 nieces and nephews, and I'd like to be even better about carving time out. But that is one of the top priorities in my life, to make time for those kids, to be a mentor in some way, whether that's fishing or just being in the outdoors or, learning how to move through the world with some grace. Do you find a role for mentorship in your life, and or is there a role in the organization as well for that kind of mentorship?
Organizationally, we don't have the capacity. Unfortunately, we get inquiries about internships relatively frequently. We just don't have the personnel capacity to do it well. If you're going to be an organization that does that, you pretty much need someone who that's their job.
That's right.
And we have a hard time keeping up. We can't keep up with all the stuff that we're trying to do, but it would be fantastic to do that. And we're working to try and get more support for education, for sure. Personally, not so much with kids, but with, say, graduate students, young scientists. Yeah, for sure.
That's great.
I try and do a lot one-on-one. I'll give some guest lectures at universities where colleagues teach. One of the challenges in my mind, and I'm sure I'm going to get some emails after this, is I don't think our science education system in college and graduate school does a good job, actually I think they do a poor job, of teaching communication. So that scientists, they can go to a conference or talk to one another about different science projects, but as far as being able to share that, to communicate well with non-scientists, it's getting better, but overall it's pretty rare. And that's because our institutions don't teach it and they don't reward it. So for example, when I've had positions at universities, and this is not all, but most universities, I was evaluated annually based on how much grant money I could bring in, how many research articles I got published, and perhaps how many graduate students that I supported with that money. The work that I do, writing the books to translate science into fishermen's terms, writing articles in fishing magazines, the time spent on docks, developing relationships, none of that was rewarded. In fact, very, very few, I can think of one, university systems even have a category for a way for that to be rewarded or even evaluated. And that I think is a huge problem. And so in my mind, as far as mentorship, that's where I can have the most influence in a positive way. Yeah, it's where in many ways we're still operating on a education and even a management system, resource management system, based on a worldview from 60 or more years ago. And we're starting to change, but it's paradigm shifts that we need. So yeah, mentorship is hugely important, but we also need a system that supports that mentorship.
Good on you. I don't have a thing to add. I think everything you said is spot on. Stories change hearts, and hearts change policy. From a scientific perspective and capacity, we're all, as a society now, kind of grappling with AI, and what is this thing going to be? Is it going to benefit humankind and other, more than humankind, or not? Is that playing a role in your work now at this point? And do you have an outlook on that?
Not my work directly or personally. I'm well to the age of not learning as many new things like that, but collaborating with people who know those things. I'm typically younger scientists. It's better to collaborate. Yeah, AI in various ways has been useful to figure out complex data. For example, figuring out some movement patterns of fish related to spawning and those types of things, or working to figure out some of the complex relationships between things like water quality and habitat change and whatnot on fish behavior, those types of things for sure. So I think AI can, in its various types and applications, can be beneficial. But I also think that just because you get an answer doesn't mean it's a valid answer. And I think in many ways, at many times, we're not being critical of the answers that AI gives us. And I think a lot of times, and I've had some conversations with some grad students about this recently, a lot of times those students don't have the backgrounds that make it sufficient for them to really evaluate the validity of the models. So that not spending more time learning things like code and other things to create AI models or to inform them or whatnot, rather than, or not even rather than, but in addition to learning about the systems that they're working in. And if you don't have that overall background knowledge, then you're more likely to accept answers that look good, but aren't really the right answer. And in my mind, that's the biggest concern. And there's been a number of research articles, in, excuse me, in the scientific literature that address this issue that have largely gone ignored, unfortunately. So yeah, that's my concern. There can definitely be good benefits, and it's helped us out already, and others as well. But it's you have to be trained well enough and have a strong enough background to know what's valid and what's not.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that discussion about showing up and extracting versus being present and getting the entire scope of the work.
Right.
I think that's brilliant. I have one more question for you, and then the bonus round. I always like to ask about this, and I have a pretty clear idea about this, but I'm curious what your thinking is as an angler, given the tribal and kind of siloed country that we live in right now. Is, in your experience, is angling one of those avenues that can sort of get us all at the same table together? And if so, have you observed that? And are there others that you feel hopeful about that will ultimately bring this unity necessary to kind of make a turn together as a people, as opposed to just continually fighting upstream. Really, the nature of what truth itself is.
Yeah, I think angling could definitely play that role, does play that role. Because as I talked about before, there's that shared passion for people who fish. I mean, I've got friends I fish with we're definitely not on the same wavelength, politically speaking, but that doesn't really matter.
Right.
If maybe something we don't talk about, or if we do talk about it, we might disagree, but it's in a respectful way, because we've developed that trust that goes in that type of relationship, right? When you spend 8 hours a day on a 15-foot skiff with somebody, that's pretty up close and personal.
It is.
And so for that to be maintained, yeah, you have to have that level of trust and respect, even if views aren't always the same.
Yep.
I mean, I think if you don't have a diversity of views, then you're doomed, because you get into groupthink.
That's right.
And then it's inevitable. You're going to go down a rabbit hole, and it's going to be a dead end, and that's the end of that. But I mean, there's other ways. I mean, it's the same thing. I like to surf. Surfing is something that brings people together of all different stripes. And that stuff just doesn't really matter.
Exactly.
There's all kinds of levels of relationship you can develop and maintain with people without getting into those kind of silos and polarization types of situations.
Yeah.
I mean, surfing friends, I joke back and forth about, that kind of stuff. So we joke about it, knowing the disagreements and whatnot, but that's not going to disrupt the friendship. And it's the same with fishing. So it's the shared experience, but it's also going back to fishing as well as surfing. You have to invest time and energy and mental capacity in order to get any good. It's not the kind of thing that you can show up one day and catch 30 bonefish or 20 salmon or whatever it may be, or catch the monster waves. It takes a lot of time and dedication. It takes paying attention. It takes learning. It takes being able to take advice from other people. All those types of things that, if you have that kind of investment, then that helps everything else around it. And that's very different than what I think we see a lot now of knee-jerk reactions to clickbait.
Yes.
It's so superficial. And, during this time, we've talked a lot about long-term relationships, about depth, about understanding, about, excuse me, a lot of this is about connectivity, right? I talked about the connectivity of bonefish as they migrate from their home range to spawning and back, that type of thing. There's also the connectivity between different anglers or guides and anglers, or different guides, between scientists and guides, resource men. All those things are connections. But it's also about the connectivity between us and the environment that we interact with. And let's face it, the environment we depend upon.
That's right.
And if we lose that connectivity with this kind of superficial, mostly made up, sorry for the term, bullshit polarization, we lose that connectivity among ourselves. And there's no ecosystem in the world that is going to sustain if it loses that connectivity. And salmon's a great example, right? You put up the dams, you break that connectivity, and you're done.
You got it.
So yeah, I think those types of things are really important. And so I think getting kids involved in those types of activities is important too. Because the old people have screwed it up enough. Maybe give the younger people a chance to fix it, because it's their future.
What a great conversation! Thank you, man. This is just such wisdom and food, literally food for the soul, food for thought. You're not going to escape though without the bonus question, which everybody gets. Oh, it's truly, it's not as painful as it sounds. just a little imagination game. You're living in a part of the world where, well, you know what? The water can rise. And let's just pretend for a minute that the water was really rising and you had to get out of the house. So you're going to get your loved ones first, your pets, the dear ones to you first out of the house. But is there one physical thing that you would take with the rising waters before you got out of the house?
Ow. Huh. One physical thing I would take. That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
It'd probably be my stand-up paddleboard with my fishing rod.
Well, duh. Of course it would be. All right. Well, let's delve a little
Build
further.
it deeper.
Yeah, let's say it's one metaphysical thing, one personality trait about you. If you could only take one that makes you, what would you take?
Integrity.
I can see that. Dr. Aaron Adams, thank you for a insightful and a wonderful conversation. How can folks get in touch with the work that you're doing? Where should they go to check out what you're up to?
The best way is to go to bonefishtarpontrust.org or btt.org. Our website is fantastic. We have a great PR marketing side, social media on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Vimeo, the whole thing, X, Twitter, where we have that presence. Yeah, you can subscribe to our newsletter, our social media feeds. But the biggest thing is, become involved, become part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Well, thank you, sir. I hope to meet you in person one day, and maybe even get my actual eyes on some of those tarpon rolling over. Until then, have a wonderful rest of the week, and we'll see you down the trail.
Thank you very much.
How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love?
Thank you for listening to Save What You Love. If you like what you're hearing, you can help keep these conversations coming your way by giving us a rating on whatever platform you're listening from and leaving a comment on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Check out photos on our Instagram feed. We're at Save What You Love Podcast, and you can get links from today's featured guest in the show notes of this episode. Join our growing community by subscribing to our newsletter at avaswild.com and then clicking on Connect in the upper corner. You'll get exclusive offers on wild salmon shipped to your door and notifications about upcoming guests and more great content on the way. That's at avaswild.com, the word save spelled backwards, wild.com. This episode was produced by Emily Fern and edited by Patrick Troll. Original music was created by Whiskey Class. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you all down the trail.